Romans chapter 4. Abraham was convinced that what God had promised, he was also able to perform. Romans chapter 4 continues to develop the theme of justification by faith that was introduced in the previous chapter. In this chapter, Paul uses the example of Abraham to demonstrate that justification has always been by faith, not by works of the law of Moses. Exegesis by sections and verses. Verses 1 to 5. Abraham received justification by faith. In these verses, Paul presents that Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, was not justified by works of the law, but by faith. Paul quotes Genesis 15 verse 6, where it's stated that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He says, "To him who works, the wages are not counted as grace but as debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness." Verses 6 to 8. The blessing of justification by faith. Paul then refers to David, another vital figure in Jewish history, who also testifies to the blessing of righteousness apart from works. He quotes from Psalm 32 to emphasize that the blessedness of being justified by faith comes from the forgiveness of sins and the removal of transgressions. Verses 9 to 12. Faith and the inclusion of all believers. Paul emphasized that Abraham's justification by faith includes not only his physical descendants, but also Gentiles who have faith in Jesus. He underscores that faith is what counts, not circumcision or keeping the law of Moses. Paul points out that the promise of justification by faith extends beyond the circumcised Jews and includes the uncircumcised Gentiles. Paul emphasized that Abraham was counted as righteous before he was circumcised. Circumcision is a sign of the righteousness that he received by faith. Verses 13 to 17. Promise through faith, not law. Paul emphasized that the promise that God made that Abraham and his descendants would inherit the earth was not through the law of Moses, but through the righteousness that comes through faith. He underscores that the promise is not only for Jews but for all who believe, and that it is based on God's grace, rather than works of the law. He points out that the law brings wrath, and that where there is no law, there is no transgression. Verses 18 to 25. Faith and the inclusion of all believers. Paul uses the example of Abraham's faith in God's promise to emphasize that faith is what justifies. He emphasizes that Abraham's faith was not weak, despite his old age, and the apparent impossibility of the promise for him to have children. Instead, Abraham was fully convinced that God was able to fulfill his promise. And God fulfilled his promise when Isaac was born. Overall summary. Romans chapter 4 continues the theme of justification by faith that was introduced in the previous chapter. Paul uses the example of Abraham to demonstrate that justification has always been by faith, not by works of the law. He emphasizes that faith is what counts, not circumcision or keeping the law, and that the promise to Abraham and his descendants is not based on the law, but on faith. This chapter emphasizes the importance of faith in God's promises, and overrules the idea that a person can achieve justification through works, or keeping the law of Moses.